Good morning. It's Monday, November 17th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 773 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FTD Morning Brief. Well, it's Saudi week. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is visiting the White House on Tuesday, and everybody is talking about the deals that Donald Trump wants to make. I'm here to tell you that they're coming, but they may not happen when Donald Trump wants them to. The Crown Prince, or MBS as he is known, can't do the normalization dance with Israel so long as those terrible pictures out of Gaza continue to play on the television screens of Saudi citizens. And those advanced military platforms that Trump wants to sell, well, Congress may have something to say about them. In case you think I'm a negative Nancy here about Saudi, I am not, most certainly not. I am a big supporter of the reforms and changes that are taking place in the kingdom. And I think that only good things lie ahead so long as Saudi stays the course. Remember, folks, normalization is a process, not an event. Ditto for reform. Both are happening, and the United States should reward both in due course. Israel's Channel 11 reported yesterday that Hamas is now stockpiling advanced weapons in other countries. Several African nations, Yemen, and others are still reportedly storing these weapons. Admittedly, if Israel knows about this, those weapons could be destroyed by the time we end today's episode. But here's something else to consider. After 2 years of war, you'd think that Hamas's enablers would realize their strategy has failed. Gaza is a disaster area because of their support to the Palestinian terror group. So maybe it's time to change course. But that doesn't appear to be in the offing right now. The Iranians, the Turks, the Qataris, the Malaysians, the Algerians, the South Africans, and others have refused to cede defeat. They keep cheering on Hamas and its war. And as a result, they have prolonged the war and extended the misery. Right now, I'm watching the Iranians and the Turks in particular. The Iranians had one tussle with Israel, and despite the beating they sustained, they're gearing up for another round, and they're exhorting Hamas to keep up the fight until the next round arrives. Turkey's rhetoric also has my attention. They're hinting that they might deploy forces to Gaza if the war continues. And from my vantage point, they're doing everything to make sure that it does continue. So while Donald Trump works to lock in that 20-point ceasefire plan and to dismantle Hamas, the terror group's patrons have other ideas. Watch this space, folks. We may be done with the war, but the war may not be done with us. It was a weekend filled with news. We all got to keep up. So here's your quick Monday morning news roundup. Some half-hearted wrangling continues at Turtle Bay over a draft UN resolution relating to the future of Gaza. The vote is set for tonight. And from what I hear, Russia is likely the only country that might try to thwart this. But if Moscow attempts to thwart this, they will be the ones to own the ensuing war. So in all likelihood, even though this UNSCR, as they call it, the UN Security Council resolution, even though this UNSCR is imperfect, this thing is likely to pass. And I suspect we'll talk about that one here on Wednesday on the FTD Morning Brief. Israel fired some warning shots at forces they spotted across the Lebanese border this weekend. The incident didn't amount to much, but the UN agency made a lot of noise about it. Tensions are high amidst reports that Hezbollah continues to rearm. In fact, Israel took out another senior terrorist, according to reports from the IDF this morning. Separately, I am hearing that Turkey and Turkish-controlled northern Cyprus have increasingly been involved in the smuggling of arms to Hezbollah. That's a space that I'm going to continue to watch. And speaking of UN agencies that are making a lot of noise, take a gander at UNRWA's social media accounts. The UN Relief and Works Agency is that corrupt international body that partnered with Hamas in the Gaza Strip for several decades. After being exposed for a wide array of support for Hamas terror activity, the agency is now trying to make the case for a return to work in Gaza. These are breathless tweets and social media posts, Instagram posts. The Israelis are not having any of it. No one is buying what UNRWA is selling, but it's all part of the cacophony of voices involved in the debate happening right now at the UN regarding Gaza's future. Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu has refused an official government inquiry into the security and intelligence collapse on October 7th, 2023. He's now asking for a non-state inquiry. Methinks the Prime Minister doth protest too much. More on that soon, I'm sure. Germany has announced the resumption of arms sales to Israel. That's got Jerusalem breathing a sigh of relief. And finally, the Israeli government has denied a request by Norway's prime minister to visit Israel. Jonas Gahr Store was hoping to secure his country's place in the Gaza reconstruction efforts. That's not happening now, and for good reason. Norway has for years mounted an effort to boycott Israeli companies through its sovereign wealth fund. The Trump administration has slapped them down for this, and apparently now so has Israel. All right, today's guest is Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. He was supposed to be with us a couple weeks ago. We had a little emergency. We had a surprise episode. I had no idea who's going to pop up on the screen. Today, I'm pretty sure I know that it will be Ahmed. He was born in Gaza. He's now based here in the United States. He's a senior fellow over there at the Atlantic Council. He leads an initiative called Realign for Palestine, and he's got a lot of things to say about what's happening in Gaza right now. So without further ado, let's talk Gaza. Welcome to the program, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib.
Great to be with you, brother.
All right, good to have you. All right, so let's start with where things are in Gaza. The yellow line, the hostages, the worsening of the weather conditions, the overall misery of the people of Gaza. Just give us a sense of what's going on.
So you have a combination of threads coming together to paint a complex picture. And apologies in advance for the sun hitting my face. I did my best this morning. But so you have the humanitarian conditions, which on some fronts they've improved as far as the number of trucks being allowed in. And we're talking two types of trucks. We're talking the usual humanitarian ones being brought in by the World Food Program, the UN, other international and regional agencies, flour, food, food parcels, etc. Then we have the commercial trucks being brought in, and those are anywhere from soap to sugar to basic household goods. And the issue with the latter type is that while that's brought a lot of relief to the locals, that has actually been a source of financial relief to Hamas as well. We have Hamas right now taxing commercial trucks and goods upward of 30 to 40% per truckload in certain areas. And so that has Hamas is attempting to reuse those to refill its coffers and pay its fighters. So that's brought some relief. We see the markets in Gaza that are coming back to life with a lot of items. We also do still have a medical sector that's still suffering from a lot of shortages. A lot of people are not able to receive basic treatments because Gaza's medical sector is in ruin. And then you have, of course, the security scene is internally, it has improved significantly as far as the reduction in crime, in thuggery, in looting, in instability. And this is beyond the yellow line. But that's also due to Hamas's own thuggery, own executions, own violence, if you will. They've succeeded in reestablishing a monopoly on violence. And so for better or for worse, Hamas remains the sole, and I'm being sarcastic, it's mainly for worse, Hamas remains the sole party that is in charge of Gaza. But of course, we're still talking about a situation where the majority of the displaced population is in tents. And that is we saw scenes over the last 2 days with the rain and the storms and the flooding of the humanitarian zones. And so there's really a state of no war, no peace. And people are just, Gaza remains a people in waiting, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that limbo is palpable. And so we need a solution, right? We need to get past this. So, let's talk about the implementation of phase 2 of that Trump 20-point plan that may be enshrined in an Ansker tonight. What do you want to see happen after, inshallah, those last 3 bodies are returned to Israel? And we have this kind of moment where everybody agrees that we can move forward. What should we be looking for right now? What are some signs that things are moving in the right direction? Or do you think that we can move in the right direction at all?
Well, I'm incredibly concerned about reports alleging that elements of the U.S. Teams might be willing to forego Hamas's disarmament to begin reconstruction. I'm concerned about the talk of maybe we do the partition of East Gaza versus West Gaza. We're talking about a tiny piece of territory that's not going to sustain life. This isn't East Germany or West Germany. I'm concerned about the players involved right now, some of the nefarious regional and international actors who have been counting on a sense of stalemate and lethargy setting in and allowing resulting in the international community eventually accepting Hamas as an indispensable player in the transitional plan. And I've been warning about this from the first day of the ceasefire, that the longer the gap exists between phase one and phase two, the more time that Hamas has an advantage to rearm, to rebuild their tunnels. They're already recollecting all the unexploded, or many unexploded munitions inside Gaza. And those are being used to create IEDs, to create fuel propellants for rockets. And so I'm hoping that the UN decision actually has teeth to it, in the sense that it gets used, rather than what we've seen some of the other Security Council resolutions that sound good on paper, but ultimately result in little. And all eyes are going to be on that international stabilization force, and whether or not it is ultimately going to be enforcing the disarmament, or merely a glorified version of UNIFIL, and that is, of course, the ineffective force in southern Lebanon.
Yeah, and obviously that would be a disaster, and so we got to keep a close eye on that. Got to keep the Qataris out, got to keep the Turks out, got to keep all the bad actors out, and somehow find people that are competent that can help step in and stabilize. But I do want to ask you about the internal dynamic among the factions within Gaza. I mean, do you think that there are people that are going to be willing to stand up to Hamas? Because I do think that that's what is so important here. It's probably crucial. I mean, we recently had Joseph Browdy on this program, I don't know, it was a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the clans and militias that are challenging Hamas rule. And I'm sure you know all these names, the Dolgmush clan and the Abu Shabab militia, and all the, I don't know, the sort of, menagerie of different actors that may, and I stress may, be willing to stand up and do something here. I mean, do they have a chance? Can they work together? Can they actually be the force that we can rely on if these foreign actors don't step in? And I don't suspect they will. I mean, right, we talk about the lack of efficacy from UNIFIL, and it's because there's no Irish guy that wants to lay down his life for Lebanon. And I would say similarly, you're not going to see some Indonesian guy want to lay down his life for Gaza, right? So you've got to have people with skin in the game. Do the people in Gaza that have skin in the game, do they have competence?
Well, I have gotten to know some of these elements of opposition, and there's tiers of opposition. There's the youth opposition. There's just the some merchants that are being taxed 30, 40, even 50% opposition. The clans and the militias, in my assessment, as having studied intelligence and national security and military science, and having a deep understanding of Gaza, I do not assess that they are ever going to be capable of taking on Hamas. That is not a condemnation of their bravery or their willingness to take them on, but they're very hyper localized in terms of their level of support. They come like even the Abu Shabab folks, whom again I got to just know some of them from afar. Like even the way that the Gaza and Arabic they speak, they're Bedouins. Like you have to actually listen carefully to some of their words that they're saying to understand them. So that's not going to be widely accepted across the society. They're not going to be the mobilizing, inspiring force. It doesn't mean they will never have a role, but I'm not looking to any of these militias to necessarily take on Hamas. What I have written about, and I've said it online, I've said it in the Atlantic magazine, I've said it behind the scenes to a lot of policymakers and off the record meetings, is that I actually think that to address the point you laid out, and we've even seen the Azeris from Azerbaijan saying, we're not going to take on fighting in Gaza. I'm like, well, what's the point of the whole force anyway? But to address that gap, there could be an element of the force that is run by private enterprise, private companies, private military contractors that form kind of the rapid reaction force, if you will, that form the strike component of the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, such that they can go into certain areas. You have tier one operators that can draw out Hamas, that can go and actually disarm Hamas, that can go and discover where the tunnels are, that can deploy highly precise application of firepower. And then behind them, the ISF forces and troops can come in and kind of mop up and clean up. And I've been sharing this.
I like this. And of course, the Israelis can be part of this too, right? I mean, it's not like they can't be at least maybe directing it from afar. Maybe they're not the ones that conduct the strikes, but I could imagine that, maybe the intelligence that the Israelis provide, or some kind of support, air support, satellite support, drone support, et cetera. I can imagine that somehow this could work. And that does give me, I guess, some confidence as you lay it out. One thing that I think I want to go back on, just so folks understand as they're listening or watching, is when Ahmed talks about this, the dialect spoken by some of these clans and militias. This has always been a thing within the Palestinian context, right? You've got kind of Northwest Bank dialect, you've got Southern West Bank dialect, you've got Gaza dialect, you've got Bedouin dialect. These things matter in this part of the world. I mean, we don't really think about it so much here in the United States. You got a Southern accent, you can still go to Washington and you can still be a senator, right? No one cares about that. But there is this sort of sense of like, well, if you sound like a hillbilly, well, then maybe you're not the person that's, really designed to run, or you're not qualified to run for office. That's the kind of thing that plays heavily into the minds of not just Palestinians, but we see it all across the Arab world. If you don't sound the part, maybe you don't belong there. And that has always been an interesting element of Arab culture that I've picked up on. And I've always just been fascinated by it, because everybody is still speaking Arabic at the end of the day, right? That's kind of the wacky part. But at any rate, it's
kind of like Sadat. It was a breakthrough that Sadat was somewhat, he was like significantly darker skinned than some of the others because of his southern roots in Egypt, but he sounded like those things can be overcome. I'm not saying they're insurmountable, but the idea in a Gaza context is, you have 2/3 of the society that are labeled refugees or descendants of refugees, and then 1/3 that are called natives. And then within the natives, you have two types of natives. You have the clans, and then you have the Bedouins. And within the Bedouins, you have the native Bedouins, and then you have the nomadic Bedouins. And so those subtleties, actually, you're right. Like, they do matter, at least in a transitional context.
Yeah, and it's funny. One of the first articles that I ever wrote as I waded into the think tank world was the difference between West Bank and Gaza, the way that they spoke and the way that that played into their perceptions of one another, right? So you have the people of the West Bank that sound a little bit more Jordanian, more Levantine. You've got the Gazans that sound a little bit more like Egyptians, and they don't like there's like a trust barrier that can't be overcome as a result of this. And so when you and it's crazy, right? The Gazans look at West Bankers like they're kind of, stuck up New Englanders. And the West Bankers look at Gazans like they're, Appalachians, right? Or something like that.
Precisely.
And the dialect actually plays into these preconceived ideas. And it actually really does. The thing that I found shocking, Ahmed, is that, we all talk about Palestinian nationalism and this sort of unity of the Palestinian cause. This is like a fault line that no one ever talks about. And it's just, it's how they speak. It's a kind of a weird thing, right?
Well, and that's one of the things I appreciated about Jared Kushner a little over a month ago, and he spoke about how, and this is something that I've been championing for a while, is that there is this falsehood that is part of the Palestinian National Project, in which there's this centralized nationalism, if you will, when Gaza and the West Bank culturally are so radically different. People in Nablus in northern West Bank are radically different than people in Hebron in the south. And so I have been championing the idea of a federated system, a federalist system for the Palestinians, not even with Israel, just for the Palestinians, something to acknowledge that California and Texas are never going to be run by a central government. We're under the auspices of the United States, but a lot of times when I promote Gaza development, Gaza's rejuvenation, Gaza's recovery, so many West Bankers attack me viciously and say, well, you want to separate Gaza from the West Bank. I'm like, guess what? They've been separated geographically and culturally for decades. And so that's something that, and this is under the radical pragmatism of, this is the philosophical framework, if you will, of Realign for Palestine, the shop that I started at the Atlantic Council. It's much more than just a project that has specific goals. It's about a framework, a way of thinking, the embrace of multiple truth, the rejection of violence, the idea of the two-nation solution, which is simply, it's not even getting into the weeds of the two-state solution, but it's just acknowledging that there needs to be two separate states for Israelis and Palestinians, two separate spaces in which they both express their unique national identities. And that's kind of a reaction to this increased, I think, ridiculous idea of a one-state solution for both Israelis and Palestinians. But radical pragmatism is the philosophical and political and strategic underpinning of my thought process as far as having better relations with Israel, as far as how you go about de-radicalization, as far as embracing that Israelis and Palestinians, we can't wait until they all completely 100% love each other, because that's not ever going to happen. That there are tiers in which you can build towards that. But one of the main components of radical pragmatism for me is that Gaza has got to be the role model for effective Palestinian self-governance, for what a military occupation-free West Bank can and should look like. We've wasted 2 decades now in Gaza since the 2005 disengagement. I left 1 month before the disengagement in 2005, and I was supposed to go back a year later, and then Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier, and I couldn't go back in. And so we've wasted tens of billions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives for nothing. And so there is no resolution, there is no peace without solving Gaza first, which is much more finite, well-defined than the West Bank.
So let me ask you something. And this is a concept that I've been kind of noodling. Maybe you and I can write about it. But this idea that the Gaza situation, the governance there needs to be settled first. Is it possible in your mind that whatever we stand up in Gaza could end up being stronger than the Palestinian Authority itself? I mean, in other words, Palestinian Authority is near collapse. You got this guy who's like 90 years old, and he's been, president now for 20 years into a 4-year term, totally corrupt. He's wasted huge amounts of American dollars. You don't see him gaining any popularity, and he's certainly not opening up the space for political dialogue in the West. I mean, this is total political and economic corruption. You have an idea now of creating something different in Gaza, right? And it's something that with enough support from the United States and the international community, it could take off, right? I mean, we got to do a lot to make sure that it does. But if you actually can create a government structure that functions, is it possible that Gaza ends up kind of subsuming the West Bank government? In other words, it's Gaza first, if I can borrow from the Oslo process. You start there with the model and have it extend into the West Bank. Because we keep hearing about how the West Bank Palestinian Authority is supposed to be the new governing structure that takes over Gaza. Nobody wants this.
I mean, you're speaking my language here, and actually, Gaza first is very much so my motto. We should let the listeners know that Palestinians historically have had anxieties about Gaza first being Gaza only or Gaza last. So that is just something we got to put out there. But for me, it's like we never even got to that stage. We never got to a place where Gaza could truly be a thriving, successful model that politically, economically, and in terms of connectivity with Israel, with Egypt, through a seaport, through an airport, just Gaza as a portal for Palestinian statehood and regional integration. We never even got there. And that's what I'm championing right now. I do not believe, I can't, this is what's so frustrating with some of the recent recognitions of the state of Palestine. And listen, I'm very pro the broad idea of recognizing a state of Palestine. But to me, I have this internal conflict in that I want the recognition of a state of Palestine, but we just legitimize this moribund Soviet-style governance apparatus that has no business continuing to receive international legitimacy. And so I do not believe this idea that bringing the Palestinian Authority to Gaza is the pathway towards unity, the pathway towards rejuvenation. I find that complete, like, we got to start from scratch. And I think
I totally agree. And by the way, I'm not like, it's not like you see me out there waving a Palestinian flag, but I am not opposed to the idea of Palestinian nationalism. What I'm opposed to is this government, which has completely failed for decades now, with a leader that won't leave unless he keels over. Right. And we just finally started to talk about succession 20 years into his rule. This is insane. There are no parties in the West Bank. There is no political process. There's no system. So how do you recognize a government when there's no system in place? It's just a bunch of fat cronies that are running this thing. It drives me crazy. Look, I want to be respectful of your time, and we got to wrap up the program. I do want to ask you one more thing. I want to ask you about the Washington crowd, and I think this is all relevant to what we're talking about today. I saw your tweet recently about your being disappointed. This was, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, at the lack of support for the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine. They seem to be rooting for Hamas in some kind of sick and demented way. Just, if you don't mind, for 30 seconds, a minute, just tell us what you're thinking here.
Well, I think what we're seeing, the dynamics in terms of elements of the media, on social media, on college campuses, in academia, there's an element of that exists in Washington, and that is the frustration. The frustration with Israel, the hatred for Israel, the whatever towards Israel, has clouded people's judgment, whereby they're willing to overlook Hamas. They're willing to say, well, I don't like Hamas, but Israel. And I think that is very short-sighted. That is actually a terrible judgment. It overlooks what Hamas is doing, and it strips the Palestinians of agency, and it doesn't help us move forward. And when I come and speak out against Hamas, my message rings hollow to them, to some of these voices, because it's like, no, well, Israel's the problem. It's all Israel's fault. And I'm like, okay, but Hamas and Qatar and Turkey, and here's the pro-Palestine advocacy, and here's no support for Hamas is minuscule. I never heard anybody in the pro-Palestine community say we love Hamas or we support Hamas. And I'm like, where have you been for 2 years? So right. I'm very frustrated by particularly a certain cadre of young professionals that are coming out of the Ivy Leagues. And, those are the people that in due time are going to dominate the think tank world, and are going to dominate the federal government and dominate foreign policy spaces. And I'm very alarmed because I
think I just threw up a little bit in my mouth thinking about that.
Exactly. So that's what I've been experiencing. And honestly, it's very frustrating because some of them, they don't believe that I'm truly pro-Palestine. They don't believe that I am a real representative.
And you're from Gaza. That's insane, right? I mean, they literally think they can be holier than the Pope by being more radical about this. Precisely. All right. Well, look, we're gonna leave it there. I want to thank you, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, for joining us today on the FTD Morning Brief. I think we went a little bit off script today, but man, was it fun! So thank you. We hope we can have you back.
Thank you, brother.
All right, that was fun. It's time to drop the mic here, folks. But before I sign off, I want to invite you to clock on to ftd.org/events at 1 p.m. Eastern today for an event with Mark Montgomery and Craig Singleton. Those are the big brains behind our Cyber Center and China program. They're rolling out a report about their recent trip to Taiwan. It's going to be a really fascinating conversation with some important recommendations. Oh, unless you forget, you still can make that generous 2025 tax-deductible donation at ftd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FTD Morning Brief. Until then, as always, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FTD.